Good evening, friends. It's Friday, and I'm back with another tale from my collection. This time, a short story from my book, Dark Fragments. Now it's time to grab a snack, dim the lights, and let me take you into the night with a story I call I'm Alive. It was a warm summer night with lightning bugs dancing over the grass to the sounds of crickets calling. But Joyce hardly noticed. She was skinny dipping in the river by her house with Lonnie, the boy who had just moved into the ranch up the road with his family. As they came together, he kissed her and started to touch her tenderly. She felt herself becoming immersed in a flood of wonderful sensations when suddenly they were interrupted by flashing lights. Feeling her spirits fall, Joyce woke in a panic and looked around to see where the flashing lights were coming from. It looked as though a large helicopter was landing in the field by her house, and the noise was deafening. She rose from her bed, grabbing her robe, and went to the window. The lights were not flashing, though. It was only the downward movement of the aircraft and the light being broken by the branches of the tree outside her window that made it seem like they were. Looking out the window, she wondered what this nuisance was that had wakened her from such a sensual dream. As she watched, the aircraft took off again, and Joyce figured it must have been some kind of emergency landing of a helicopter from the army base nearby. She discarded her robe and returned to bed in hopes of recapturing the dream. As she drifted back to sleep, she wondered if her parents had noticed the landing. She was awakened again shortly by the sound of crashing glass and looked to her window. There was someone standing there in the shards of glass, and as she watched, another one dropped from the roof into her room. She tried to scream, but in her terror no sound came out and she was helpless as they dragged her from her bed into the night. They carried her onto the roof above her bedroom, and she watched in horror as the ship came back out of the sky and hovered above her house. It was like no helicopter or aircraft she had ever seen. A long, clear tube emerged from the ship and settled around them. As the tube ascended back into the ship, Joyce looked down on her father's ranch and wondered why no one was trying to help her. Had they hurt her parents? Inside the ship, she was led into a chamber away from the tube, and even as she fought and kicked at them, they easily stripped her of the gown she was wearing. Someone else advanced from a darkened corner of the room, holding a syringe that was obviously meant for her. Again, she fought her captors, but it was useless. The syringe entered her arm, and she fell limp to the floor. Joyce sensed, rather than felt, her body fall to the floor. Whatever they had given her rendered her totally helpless, numb, and immobile. Yet she remained acutely aware of everything that was going on around her. The depravity of external sensation was so great that she could not move her eyes nor tell if she was even breathing. She saw one of them lean over her and look into her eyes. He began to speak with a hissing voice.
"Relax, child. We mean you no harm. We have immobilized you in order to keep you from hurting yourself or one of us in your fright."
She saw a hand coming to her face.
"Now I will close your eyes so you will not have to watch as we extract one of the seeds of life from your belly. Shortly this will all be over and you will be returned to your bed, safe as you ever were."
The hand passed over her face and her eyelids were closed.
"I will open your eyes when we finish."
No one spoke to her again, and she was unable to see or feel anything that was happening. She was aware that they were there, as she could hear the sound of them moving around, but this gave no clues as to what was happening. Joyce thought she would go mad. She was experiencing total sensory deprivation, had lost track of all sense of time. After what seemed an eternity, her eyes were brushed open, and Joyce recognized the ceiling in her own room, and she could hear the clock beside her bed. She wondered if they had gone, and was answered when one of them looked into her eyes.
"Do not fear, child. The shot we gave you will wear off in a matter of hours, and you will be just as always.
The face disappeared, and she heard the loudest, most awful silence in her life. Joyce was not aware of the passage of time until the room began to get slowly brighter. In the pale light of dawn, she watched as the shadows ran slowly down the wall, as if trying to escape the light of day. Lower and lower they fled, until finally they were out of her sight and the sun shone on the wall where she could see. Soon she could hear her family bustling about the house and knew her mother would come to wake her for breakfast. Down the hall, she could hear her brother humming to himself as he brushed his teeth, and her father calling for his lost necktie. From the corner of her eye, she saw the door open, and her mother began to scream. Her father came running into the room, and then he was before her. "Daddy!" she called out to him, but her mouth did not move and no sound escaped. "Daddy, please help me! I can't move!" The thought ran rampant through her mind. If only she could find a way to tell them what was wrong. Her father sat on the bed, and she felt better. He always knew how to make her feel better. She watched as he sat there staring at her, and then saw a tear from his eye. "Don't cry, Daddy. I'll be okay whenever this wears off. I'll be good as new." The thought coursed through her, easing her mind. Then suddenly, she understood why everyone was so upset. She could picture herself lying there on the bed, unmoving, with her eyes open in an unseeing stare. "But I'm not dead, Daddy. I'm alive. I just can't move or talk yet. Daddy, where are you going? Daddy, Daddy, don't leave me!" Silence engulfed the room once more, but she could hear them down the hall. Her father was talking on the phone, and then nothing. Joyce heard the sound of strangers coming into the room and was relieved. They had called the doctor, and he would make everything okay. The doctor stood at the end of the bed for a moment, and then he reached forward and closed her eyes. She hated the darkness, but she knew the doctor was there, and she was patient. It would be all right soon. Suddenly, everything was quiet except for a humming noise in the distance, which she could not make out. Then the humming stopped, replaced by the sound of birds, quickly followed by the slamming of a door and hollow footsteps. "They've brought me to a hospital. I knew Daddy would make everything okay," she thought. It seemed like forever before she heard anything again, and when she did, the sounds puzzled her. Two men were talking about seeing what happened to this one, and she wondered, what do they mean by this one? She heard the sound of metal clanking in a drawer, followed by a man's voice. Upon examination, we have an average female, approximately 16 years of age. Development appears normal, and there are no obvious signs of violence nor any abnormalities to indicate foul play. The eyes. Suddenly her eyes were open and she could see a bright light in his face. Are blue and clear, with no evidence of abnormality. She saw him clearly as he walked to the end of the table. She was lying on the table naked, and her head was propped from behind so that she was looking down the length of her body. She knew that if she could feel anything, her neck would be very sore, and it would be hard to breathe. He continued to speak. "Lacking any external cause, we will now proceed with the abdominal cavity survey." What does he mean? Abdominal cavity survey? What's he doing with that knife? "No, don't cut me. I'm not dead. You're not supposed to cut someone who's alive." Her mind reeled in horror as she saw him use a scalpel to cut a Y incision from the top of her chest down to her sternum, before continuing down to the bottom of her belly. There was no blood, but she could see the pink tissues under the skin. He thrust his fingers into her stomach, pulling her open, and reached inside. She watched as he began to remove her organs and screamed her silent screams of horror. There are no signs of abnormality within the abdominal cavity, I have just severed the diaphragm, and the heart and lungs appear to be nor. He stopped in mid-word. The heart has begun to beat, and the lungs are expanding. This is impossible. I don't understand. She saw blood begin to pulse out of the opening in her belly and spray his face, and could feel herself drawing a deep breath. Suddenly, immense pain coursed through her whole body, and she reached up to close the gaping wound as she screamed with her dying breath, "I'm alive!" Ooh, chilling. Thank you for spending your time with me. If you like the story, how about giving me a thumbs up and consider hitting that subscribe button? Tell me what you think in the comments, and I'll be sure to join in the conversation. That's all for tonight, but I'll be back next Friday with another story. So until then, sleep well.